Thank you. Yes, thanks to Bo and Christina for setting up the talk. I very much appreciate being here to meet you all in this department and coming to Sweden for the first time. So I'm talking today about my book project, sort of a little dip into what this project has been about, what it's meant for me, and what I hope it can offer you here in Malmö. So the book essentially thinks about a set of questions, and those questions start with whose stories underpin design, and what methods might be possible if we were to essentially tell those stories as designers differently. So the book explores these questions across a series of case studies, and those case studies span sort of a range of worlds, from untold stories around the transatlantic slave trade toward the kinds of strange feminist worlds that have been built in places like Silicon Valley in the tech spheres, to the kinds of histories of manufacturing that underpin the computer industry today, that I'm going to actually touch on today in this talk. And underlying these case studies is this concern for fabulation. So fabulation at its core tends to this notion of relaying as fable or as myth, right? It comes from the particle stem fabulare, to speak. And feminist scholars, Vinciane Beaudepre, Saidiya Hartman, have separately discussed sort of fabulation as a kind of storytelling, right? As a storytelling that blends the real with the imaginary in ways that sort of rebuild the worlds around them. So Dupre, in her book, What Would Animals Say If They Asked the Right Questions, she describes this kind of complicated relationship between animals and human beings. So the way in which, essentially by multiplying and inverting the stories that we tell about and with science, we can, she says, create stories, make history, and reconstruct, fabulate in ways that open up other possibilities for the past and the present and the future. And later from Saidiya Hartman, I learned what it could mean to sort of narrate the impossible. So she's making visible sort of the scandal of historical memory in these contexts, in these archival worlds that render lives like Venus, who is a former female slave, render those lives that unknowable and unknown, right? So Saidiya Hartman coined this phrase. Saidiya Hartman coined the phrase critical fabulation in her vivid essay, Venus in Two Acts, to describe this approach of kind of writing against the archive. And in it, she says, by playing with and rearranging the basic elements of the story, by representing the sequence of events in divergent stories, and from contested points of view, I have attempted to jeopardize the status of the event, to displace the received or authorized account, and to imagine what might have happened, what might have been said, and what might have been done, right? There's almost a designerly impulse behind this kind of world building possible from this reimagining. So in bringing these fabulatory practices to the worlds of design that we inhabit here, I want to understand that practice as something quite different from the kind of separative worlds of investigation on the one hand and intervention on the other. So what would it mean to do a kind of inquiry and activism together? You know, what would it mean to make design both personal and culturally situated? And how would we do this in a responsive and responsible manner? So in this talk, I want to show that this kind of work takes two forms of intervention. First, it takes coming to terms with design's sort of dominant hegemonic lineages, right? these lineages that we're so familiar with in our courses, in our scholarship, in our practice. And it means in this coming to know those lineages, it means coming to know them in new ways. Right? And I ground this project in my book in kind of traditions of feminist technoscience that I've encountered along my path. And the second part of this intervention means enhancing those existing design methodologies based on the alternative inheritances, right? These alternative theoretical lineages. And this work demands sort of engaging different bodies, different practices, different programs of action within these contemporary sites of design. So in this work, I'm claiming that we need to enlarge the sort of very methods and relationships out of which designers conceive of and author worlds. So together these interventions sort of make room for then drawing the intellectual trajectory of design sort of otherwise, right? It means inviting these different modes of inhabiting the situation of our world today. And across these two interventions, I'm going to sort of try to show you that critical fabulations may do more than just destabilize this dominant paradigm, but also show how those disenfranchised from design and cultures of innovation broadly are nonetheless actively contributing to these modes of doing. So with this, I want to start with a story, one of the stories that this book tells, which is a project I worked on with several scholars, including Samantha Shorey, Helen Remick, and Brock Kraft. So this is now a short image, sort of a clip from a long documentary miniseries called Moon Machines. And I came across this while doing my fieldwork in 2008 and was really struck because here you see two women, rolled up sleeves, sort of passing a needle through this like grid of eyelets, metal eyelet holes. And to me, as maybe many of you in the room, at first, this process struck me as quite familiar. It resembled a kind of weaving, right? There's kind of a lacing of threads in orthogonal directions. The weavers, in this case, seem to have unconventional materials, right? Sort of magnetic rings and wire and this odd-shaped loom with cuts on the side. And in the setting, they seem to be maybe low-wage laborers working in kind of factory form. And over this scene, just a few seconds long, we hear the voice of Richard Batten, pictured here, who's a managing director at Raytheon Factory, and he says, "We call this the LOL method, the little old lady method for wiring cores." So before, LOL referred to laughing out loud. In this context, LOL was part of the larger NASA mission to create software for the Apollo moon program. So this footage, which is only a few seconds long, if not for the voice of Batten, comprises one of the only surviving accounts of the women who physically wove that software for the moon. So by threading these wires around and through these sort of donut-shaped magnetic cores, they created a form of information storage that's called core memory. So across the 1950s and 60s, core memory was one of the principal mechanisms by which computers stored and retrieved information. So if you lace a thread through one of these metal rings, or magnetized rings, you'd create a 1, and bypassing that core would create a 0, right? A physical distinction produced. And of course, this was a time when computers looked more like this, right? They were these massive, heavy, almost sort of box-like machines that took up huge amounts of these massive warehouses. And this was during the 1961 when the Apollo guidance computer project began. And at this time, what was necessary to create something that would fit inside the cone of a rocket needed to be quite different, right? So fitting inside this rocket meant it needed to contain this much smaller space, but of course also not require the loads of electricity and withstanding extreme temperatures and vibration that space travel would demand. So it needed to create essentially one of the computers that wouldn't be reliant on any direct communication with mission control on Earth. And this weaving of cores met each of these challenges. So what we know today about this project, and why I bring it up now, is because essentially all of these stories told about core memory work reinforce this vision of whose knowledge, whose labor became important to the work ahead. And that is the people like Richard Batten. They were mostly American white men who were associated with the program of Apollo and the moon travel. So bringing this kind of critical fabulation to the scene meant kind of asking in what ways could we retell and understand this story differently, and bringing design to the floor. So to begin answering this question, I looked at the broader process of core memory development, and that included something called core memory planes, which developed alongside core memory rope, which you saw earlier. But it required even smaller instruments and even sort of microscopes like you see here. And I ordered a few of these planes. Luckily, I found them through an online retailer in Russia, in fact, and came up with these P2P8 sort of deck computer replica planes, holding them kind of in my hands. It was astounding to see the detailed work, but also the scale of these planes reminded me so much of another form of sort of memory work and even gendered labor, and that is, in fact, of quilting. They reminded me so much of the quilt patches that I, in the coming months, began collaborating with colleagues to create an interactive electronic quilt made up of the planes themselves. So the patches would then materialize the work of the core memory weavers, but also sort of propose these different possibilities and points of encounter ahead. So in particular, working with master quilter Helen Remick and researcher Samantha Shorey, Brock Kraft, I continued to situate this core memory in this sort of feminized lineage of practice, and sort of imagining modes of craftwork as forms of engineering and casting engineering as a form of craftwork in return. So during a series of workshops that followed, we would invite a range of folks from historians of technology to design educators, to members of the public who visited Maker Summit, to kind of assemble what we call these kinds of patch kits. And the kits comprised a kind of board loom and strings and beads, these almost kindergarten supplies, in place of the ferrite core and wire. And once assembled, each kit became a future quilt square. So people would assemble these patches, explore kind of our archive of media materials as a result. So what they would do is actually attach these patches to the quilt, and the quilt would then play aloud one of the clips, the audio clips of first-hand accounts we had collected. So plugging in this assembled patch would sort of play through a microcontroller that content. But it would also tweet through our LOL Weavers account the same kind of short clips of content, reflecting roughly the same amount of data that each of these planes held, which is 140 characters. So one tweet, for example, highlighted the sort of gendered dexterity of the weavers, saying the female operators were good at it and those that stood around telling them what to do were terrible at it. And a key event in this project was meeting Helen Remick, who herself had been quilting with obsolescent technology for many years, old slide decks, film strip CDs, things that actually spoke to family stories that she had kept in archives herself. And these experiments for her even were not new, right? She had been growing up in the Bay Area at a time in the 1950s when she wasn't allowed to take drafting in her high school. Her teacher, she recalled, had said that girls were too much of a distraction. So since drafting was a prerequisite for admission to the engineering school at UC Berkeley, in fact, she wasn't able to major in engineering there. She later became a psychologist. And in the following decade, she actually was instrumental in building one of the first affirmative action programs at the University of Washington and then countrywide. So she built one of the very first initiatives for women at the university. And across that kind of career, she was continuously, right, turning these challenges to equal opportunity into sort of programs of responsibility and action. And in doing so, she kind of lived in the frictions, right, in a way that really spoke and sort of resonated with the project at hand. Even in the current quilting practice in building this core memory object, she used a kind of laser that was originally designed for that very same drafting process that she had been denied years earlier. So together we would kind of sift through patent archives, pull up craft supplies, and remake these objects at various scales to start to understand not only the particulars of that Apollo mission, but also how the practice changed over the years. We were working at scales equivalent to just a few millimeters of weaving on those 1960s core memory planes, but we would kind of play on that quality in the design of the quilt itself, a kind of quilting trope of pattern that was exploring and exploding at different scales. Trip Around the World was the name of the pattern itself, and in fact, Helen referred to this as, I was having fun realizing we were creating a macro chip, kind of contrasting to the very difficult to repair sort of microchip, right, that you can't see your body is entangled with in practice. And this intertwining then continued in the workshops, wherein, for example, the 2017 software studies meeting, Apollo mission was a standard topic, of course, but when the kits came out, everything seemed to shift and change. Beads fell all over the place. The conference goers struggled to pass their needles through these sort of large plastic beads. And people continuously reflected on the strangeness of this process. I'm literally on step 1, said someone. I spent most of the time pulling the bead back on the string. And others moved through these instructions more easily, but then began to realize they'd skipped a bead, right? And had to undo all of the work, which is something that in fact required 40 hours or more of work in the original cores. It's humbling, someone observed. And soon the conversation turned to the sort of language we use to describe this work. How did the operators even refer to themselves, someone asked. And in this process, I hope to shed light on this question and reached out to a man named Frederick Dill, who I had been in contact with during the project. And he's an engineer, a pioneering engineer, in fact, who has just co-invented the semiconductor laser and had been involved in this work. And Dill had recently sent me this lovely book, Digital Computer Components and Circuits, with this typed and printed note that said, until this discussion, I had never heard of stringing cores as a weaving problem, but it is certainly a good view. When I asked what he meant by this via email following up, he later told me, well, you have focused on the threads, the wires, whereas I focus on the cores. Your focus on weaving is an equally valid viewpoint, but a different one. It sort of assumes that some particular configuration of weaving will produce what is needed, which is totally correct. So this is kind of astounding because in intending to the weaving alongside the electrical cores, he was also recognizing the labor of production, right, alongside the thing. And in this way, he was sort of highlighting these very different stories of contingency and embodied practice from his accounts prior. And this mechanism he recognized through his own words, will produce what is needed, right? The recognition of bodies as was quite unusual, right? Not only due to its widespread omission in the core memory literatures, but also just this deeper understanding of sort of the role that women's embodied practice and maybe just bodies at all play in engineering work, right? These core contributions to technology practice. So it kind of resonates with actually the work that Helen had reminded us of one afternoon when she said quilting isn't just handwork. It's back work, it's leg work, it's knee work, right? It's an entire practice of the body. So as we built the quilts, we encountered this process in ways that really sort of challenged the sort of mainstream accounts that we saw in public narratives. So in the MIT Museum footage that introduces the Apollo guidance computer, we saw that the interviewing journalist didn't just observe sort of the interviewing journalist here was asking, does she have to even think about which cores it goes through next? And the manager responds, Jack Poundstone, no. The machine does that for her. So these ideas, these conceptions of women laborers here as unthinking, right, as rote sort of executors of code, these were much harder to grasp one or to find compelling when we experience that process ourselves. It kind of resonates, in fact, with what Lisa Nakamura just cautions against when she talks about sort of peering inside the machine. She says, not dancing, bunny-suited clean room workers, that are happily making chips for free, but instead, she says, looking inside digital culture means both looking back in time to the roots of the computer industry and to the specific material production practices that positioned race and gender as commodities in electronic factories. Our project, in this sense, casts these design methods as these powerful sites for challenging these histories that not only reassert a kind of division of labor between sort of cognitive and manual work, but that also hide those locales, those bodies rarely associated with innovation work. So here, in a sense, technology and design become sort of metaphors for the improvement of economic conditions. And these non-designers, right, the little old ladies, neither old nor little, are embattling the forms of knowledge distribution to which they're subjected. So in drawing, again, this sort of critical fabulatory practice within design, this project helps us sort of think about collaboration with the ghosts of our technology worlds, right? We're reckoning with these untold stories and potentially imagining new ways to do. And in particular, I want to call attention to some of those sort of larger themes that underpin that, a range of scholars, Lily Orane, Serim Avle, Sylvia Littner, and many others are thinking about, Sarit Amrute, all of the ways that our technology practices are continuing to reassert. And the first of these has to do with the kind of core narrator at the center of technology worlds. So the idea that our popular narratives tend to sort of valorize the work of that sole inventor, right? That focus us on the achievements of people maybe like Neil Armstrong. And in fact, by decentering individualism, our kind of moments for reworking and retelling stories offer opportunities for kind of positioning new alliances, so new investigative partnerships with the past and present. And to legitimate their work, we as designers are often tending to frame our work as potentially neutral, right? Positioning our work to sort of not taint the worlds in which we intervene, and not taint them with our own preferences, our own concerns. But our forms of telling necessarily further entangle our own being with the spaces in which we intervene, and in fact they necessitate a sort of bringing together these objective and situated perspectives. So we must really connect those who work from the outside with those who work from within and recuperate those neglected histories of encounter. And to sort of help us generalize our ideas, we as designers are often imagining our target users in various ways, making assumptions that potentially designing for that general user reasserts a kind of dominant view. And in these critical fabulations of practice, we're kind of expanding and deepening all these long-standing focuses and maybe programmers or code that account for the practices of more making hardware, right? These positions that really create, in the electronic quilts case, and the work of weaving becomes a kind of interference, a kind of proposal in which these contingent analyses change existing regimes of practice. And lastly, to identify our opportunities ahead, designers are sometimes directing these exercises toward an end, right? That end has a kind of prefigured form, often a technological one. And that work is involving sort of, in our own practice, a kind of concern for not just the now, but the future in terms of its continued circulation and practice. So mending a broken circuit here required engaging with Helen Remick's macro chip, right? The kind of imagining of our bodies in relation to the thing. So using design as extensions means sustaining these material outputs through practice. So resetting design in this sense and retracing a history will involve inhabiting these two, in this case, stories of practice. And looking at their intersection, we're seeing a kind of retracing of design's commitment through an alternative theoretical compass. And when Herbert Simon, famed Nobel laureate, kind of cast design as a science of artificial, in many cases, design scholars then used his ideas to help kind of sediment a cognitivist orientation, right, in the field. Sort of thinking about the rendering of an investigation as a place in which the investigator's status is irrelevant, right? Focusing on an investigator where they sit in the world is, in fact, maybe potentially jeopardizing the scientific purity, right, of thought. But of course, years later, Allison Adams pointed out that that sample that represented the general population and Simon and Newell's experiments was in fact made up of probably all participants who are students at Carnegie Mellon University, and not only that, but probably all white men. And this meant that they were stand-ins, right, for the everyone, that dominant view. So as the ideas descend, the stories sometimes stay the same, or methods or participatory design, for example, have made important inroads at the borderlands of practice, but have we potentially still failed to overturn what Sarah Ahmed has called a sort of liberal promise of inclusion? And even in my own work, I've found this to be the case. So the ideas that came about through my PhD research, a story I also tell in my book, sort of enlivens this idea that, in fact, a user-centered design or human-centered design gaze can sometimes still occlude the very fact that human-centeredness is scoped and positioning in this case, my own world, as in fact obscuring the worlds of, in this case, many of the folks that lived outside the Bay Area maker culture, but still had to grapple with that culture every day. And as I continue to learn through fieldwork at the Stanford D School, this was involving a necessitating almost a kind of reasserting of these theoretical lineages. And that these intellectual seams, and in this particular integration of thinking and doing, is again this project of critical fabulation. So critical fabulations then speak to ways of telling stories, really. these kinds of stories that awaken silenced knowledges. They kind of deconstruct the past to then open these different possibilities for the present that then create opportunities in the future. So again, this involves treating the canonical design history as a site of critical rereading, right? And these stories work as just more than conceptual anchors. They're really also describing and embodying a thinking practice, so reworking our methods ahead. So to look for these opportunities for collective inquiry, we may in fact attend to how those actors are already residing in this setting, that when they may offer their own questions, their own orientations, and even their own interventions, right, without our presence. And this way we can ask how when we inquire in concert with those in this design setting. And to identify bodies that are sort of left in the shadows, we may also listen for those murmurs of kind of hidden practice, attending to these voices on the margins. So it involves asking, again, what histories of practice have been suppressed or lighted. And in becoming kind of sensitive to these totalizing gestures that represent the making of futures by some for others, we might look for representations of cultural life that run through kind of a design setting, but then contribute in these other modes at the peripheries. And this means kind of asking what representations feed a prevailing design narrative, and with really whom do they represent and whom do they not. And finally, to avoid sort of fetishizing the form of presentations or articles, and the investigators might sort of explore these collaborative forms among actors that are already underway, right? So what forms of collective authorship kind of are actors already gathering around? So questions like these kind of expose the trappings of a field that in some ways is already complicit with the responsibilities that are lost or obscured, right, through a human-centered gaze. And they show that maybe human-centered, in Ahmed's words, could be a lesson in being not as much as being in. In this sense, it requires untangling our design methods one by one and revisiting them in projects big and small. Our citational practices, our exemplars, our scholarship, what do we bring into the classroom? What do we reproduce through our work? And I want to end with a kind of question Sadiya Cartman poses, which is what is required to imagine that free state or an impossible story? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So now I'm going to give the microphone to Christina Lindström, who's going to ask a few questions, and then we'll open for anyone else. Please.
Thank you. First, I just wanted to say that I'm so happy that you're here, and now listening to your talk, I remembered, or I started to think about like when we first met and so on, and I remembered it must be almost 10 years ago now, that, no, not that we met, but when me and Åsa were PhD students, one of our supervisors, Pelle Ehn, had seen your work and suggested that we would look into it, and now, and that was also related to this work on the knitting circle. So it's really nice to have you here now, and also to see how your work has developed. And of course we've met several times in between that, but now this is the first time you're here. So that's really nice.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah.
And I would also say that there is lots of more details and things in the book that, for example, this retracing of the design history that I would suggest that you, who hasn't read the book yet, will engage with, because, and I think it's also something that I will definitely use in teaching, because I've read so many versions of this history, but I think this brings also a more critical perspective on that. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
But of course, then I also have just a few questions, and then we'll open up for more questions. So listening to you now and also reading the book, I feel that this project is very much about, in a way, challenging, not just providing a new method, but also challenging the foundations or the underpinning stories of design. And I think that is something that is not just in this book, but a lot of other parallel projects to this book is doing this kind of work. So for example, we can think of decolonizing design as one such collective or movement. conversation. And another one that I think of is design and posthumanism. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Gothenburg at HDK, the design school there, where we're now starting this kind of network on design and posthumanism. And I think all of these different conversations bring different kinds of critique to the foundations of design, and also an attention to not just the future of design, but also the past.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, maybe this is a very difficult question, but it made me think of, so why at this particular time is there such interest in engaging with not just new methods or new theories, but also the past, the history of design, and so the foundation, if you have any thoughts on that, and what that tells us about the present.
I mean, it tells us we're catching up, because this has been happening in many, countless fields for a long time. And in fact, in some ways, you know, it has happened in design as well, this sort of rereading of our history. We do that through every time we take up a method, we're in some way, you know, shaping it and adapting it, and in that way we're revisiting a past even if we don't recognize. And so the field of science and technology studies, for example, or sort of history of technology, has been doing this within engineering worlds, and potentially it's about sort of bringing these fields together at a time when we need it most in terms of the kind of discourse around innovation, the sort of ways in which right now we're seeing the unmaking of democracy across the globe. This is a time in which we need to kind of reassemble our tool sets and be sure that in our classrooms and in our practice we are continuing to be accountable, right, to the worlds that we shape. And yeah, I think it's ever more important. It's always been, but it feels like there's a sort of mounting significance to this reckoning with the sort of our complicity in a system we might not actually like the future of, and that we're all a part of. And I would say also, to your point on these sort of parallel tracks, and my hope is actually with this book to be less about sort of inscribing a kind of feminist epistemology or historical rereading on every design project, than inviting different rereadings and from a kind of feminist stance. That's where I've been informed from personally, but from a range of scholarship that hasn't yet been accounted for, and voices that have not been taken seriously within design fields. So this could come out of disability studies rereadings of design, and sort of the thinking around critical race theory that's happening in many important networks in design and technology worlds, and these ideas that are brought in to sort of revisit the sort of oppressive epistemologies and hegemonic narratives that are continuing to be reinforced in the many spaces that we inhabit. Yeah.
So my next question is, so if we think about what kind of design has been kind of the main, the dominant paradigm, or the dominant versions of design has also acted within certain context, or has, I guess it would be fair to say that it's also highly entangled in specific kinds of conditions, or for example, a capitalist economical system. So, and towards the end, you suggest these tactics to work with that I think can be very valuable. But I'm also thinking of where and whom can practice these. So where do you imagining these to be put to work? Could it be within that existing context, or is it more about creating alternatives, places, or alliances?
Yeah, and who for whom and why. And yes, I mean, these tactics were sort of a beginning more than an end for me personally, thinking about sort of how to put this into practice, and have been revising and revisiting these for the last year since this book came out, or since the book was submitted, I guess I should say. The idea being that in a sense the way in which designers that we train in the university context are often not trained to decide when not to design or when not to intervene, and that in a sense we can't ignore the fact that there are professional designers that are being trained by our own programs, and what responsibility do we have to sort of think through and in fact speaking to designers what training is necessary in order to know who to collaborate with and how, right? So this kind of sense of work that I've done recently with a student named Cindy Bennett around empathy and sort of configuring this idea of trying to be like another. As a designer, we train them to sort of empathize or to put ourselves in another's experience, and in that process are displacing, right, the experience of someone else, and that their voice is not invited into the conversation. So there's this sort of sense of instead of being like, being with another. And this has resonances with designing with, right, this sort of program of participatory design that is so central here. And yet it's also about not just the design as the process, right? That in a sense being with is also about sort of the range of activities around design, from recruitment practice to writing practice that I know Anne Light has written about recently. And these ideas that connect us to other programs of practice, whether it's cultural anthropologists working in the field, working with vulnerable groups and trained for decades in thinking about what that being with is, right? That we are being with that constellation of actors that are also not in design roles, right? Or occupying design programs. So that's kind of where the tactics come out of, is a sense for what do we need as educators and as people that are again, doing design work in the field.
So my last question has to do perhaps a bit about, well, no, I'll start in another way. So this book is told, of course, from somewhere, and it's not doesn't claim to provide like a full story of every kind of design. It's a partial story, and it's also very much told through your own experiences and design engagement. But of course now the book is starting to circulate, and when I read it, of course I also tried to make my connections and relating to like how could areas of design that I've been influenced by potentially interfere or become interfered in, I don't know if that's how you say, by this your proposal. And here I'm thinking, for example, about participatory design. You mentioned it, but it's not super present in the book as such. And I'm not going to ask you to situate the work in relation to participatory design, but I'm thinking that when you wrote the book, and also now that it's starting to circulate, I'm sure, when you wrote the book, I'm sure you also made different kinds of cuts of what to include and what to exclude. And now that it's starting to circulate, I'm sure you will encounter different kinds of margins and different kinds of centers. So I'm curious to now that it's out, what you're curious to continue to work with, if you have encountered stories or areas that you would like, that you're curious to continue to work with.
No, thanks for that prompt, because I think, my own training in the United States, and in particular in this program at Berkeley, is, I encountered participatory design in rare moments rather than as sort of my own training, right? So I think that is particularly the sort of my rationale for, there was a version of the book that had more centrally engaged with participatory design, and I wasn't ready to do that, I think, because that story isn't something that I know where to go yet. And it's very interesting to me to think, again, coming back to what participatory design does so well, and sort of its own, like the sort of underpinnings of participatory design as contextualized within a Scandinavian context in this sort of organization of labor here, for example, in Sweden. So thinking about the particulars of that practice and how stripping it, as many of you know, stripping it from one context, placing it in another, in the United States has essentially reformulated it as a non-political or apolitical practice, right? Not, I don't want to tell that story because it's not my story to tell. But I also find that there's a real potential for thinking about those same questions of sort of what lineages, inform participatory design, and how might we even reread these again. It's obviously, you hear very similar names, right? So when you kind of think about participatory design in the public sphere, you hear PLN, and you hear about these sort of central projects that have sort of shaped the world that PD has blossomed within. But how can we also, Susan Butker's work, how can we think about also revealing the ways in which these kinds of stories told through PD practice are also grappling with who's not in the room, who's resulted in how it's even possible to have these convenings, right? What kind of colonial legacies they rely on, and they've leveraged. So I think, asking these harder questions maybe of our disciplines in each of our own spheres is a starting point.
Thank you. So I guess I'll go back to you.
Thank you. We're open for anyone here, and I'm going to move around with the mic so we can get it on tape as well, the questions. So who would like to start? This is why we have a discussion to get someone to start, but then the point is that someone else will take over after that.
We answered all the questions, right?
Okay.
Hi, I'm Margarita Mellon, and I'm a senior lecturer here at K3.
Nice to meet you.
Together with Christina and Åsa, we worked on a quilting project. When was that? It's about 8 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that. Anyway. And this became a physical quilt where we played with words, we played with concepts, and we toured the quilt itself, and us toured around in different art galleries and talked blah blah blah. And very deliberately we made it so that it wasn't finished. We could see through the inside. There were stitches that were non-finished, and there were threads hanging down, etc. And when I talked about this in quilting context, i.e. in groups of women, because they're mainly women, where that are quilters, that are, some of them are professional quilters, some of them are amateur quilters, but they do it regularly and a lot, right? So they're very proficient. And in every single one of these groups, when I talked about our project, I met anger. I mean, serious anger. And they would say, oh, you say you're coming from a feminist perspective, and then you're doing this shit. What is this?
Ah, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So now I am a textile crafter and designer as well, but to them, this was, it was glee. I mean, it was making fun of them. It was making fun of their work. The fact that it wasn't ready. Yeah. And when I talked about Åsa and Christina's other work, they said, oh, that is terrible. Why can't they take us seriously? So I wonder what you're saying, what you're thinking about, because they would say the same thing about what you're doing. You're making fun of our work.
Well, it's interesting because I don't need it. I do tell a kind of similar story in the book, which is a project that I worked on around the rise of something called this sort of indie craft movement, this sort of maker nation, or idea that suddenly knitting was cool. In the Bay Area, I was working at a tech company called Adobe, and they created, creative tools for designers, and they had this new sort of stretch of work around hobbyist tools, and in those hobbyist tools, they were, basically creating bigger buttons for Photoshop and less functions. and I was embedded in this sort of indie craft world and thinking, hey, hobbyists, like there's so much to learn here. I came in as a sort of human-centered designer, and I was thinking, oh, why not, think about craft as an opportunity for sort of imagining design. But my approach as a human-centered perspective was to say, okay, I'm going to now like spend time in these knitting worlds and build a technology that sort of serves their needs, because that's what I did. I saw that people were picking up their cell phones, picking up their knitting, and kind of intertwining the two, using something called Ravelry, which is the social media network around the knitting. And so I in order to sort of support all of these design guidelines that I observed, I kind of built this tool called Spin that maybe Christina was referring to, which was a kind of tool that lets you basically annotate knits as you're knitting. So you can kind of tell stories through the knitting process. And, these objects came about that were like recipe scarves, where there's like a cooking recipe embedded, or, people were like traveling to different areas and they would have a kind of travel journal or a kind of puzzle in one hand. And I would study these in sort of these small field tests. Anyhow, I essentially created this program, this similar kind of like project, done, complete, told a story, and realized I wasn't done because I hadn't really thought through what this meant in sort of a broad range of practice that was outside my convenient world of indie craft. So I joined a knitting guild on the south side of San Francisco, and this is now a project that entailed basically exactly this anger, right? This sort of realization that I had done a project that included the lives and history of many people that saw themselves as essential contributors to this world of textile craft, and were in fact themselves embodying a kind of a lineage of practice that they wanted to hold dear, and that I was again like making fun of or kind of invading, right, through this other work, through not only the fact that I was there trivializing it, right, in a sense, my craft work was shoddy, any sample I showed them was just embarrassing, but also in the sense that there is a kind of, what I talk about as a kind of a technology of enchantment that has this kind of effect after Gell, that has this effect of sort of being dismantled through a technology that shows you what's underneath the surface, right? This idea that you could see anything that they were doing from the lens up close, like I was exposing it through the technology. So this was a lesson of coming to terms with, again, the underpinning kind of assumptions that went into this program of design that assumes I could essentially generalize my audience. This knitting, this user group was a category that couldn't kind of stay together as a cohesive group once they opened up, right, the curtain and really looked deeper inside. And that in fact these same folks that hated this trivializing, this kind of intervention that I did, they became very close colleagues and friends, and we began working with electronics in a very different sense, in more actually the sense of the quilt project I showed earlier. So we began building these little tatted objects. The tatting is a lace making technique in which they were called wind chime earrings, where like wind would flow and then they would glow in these various ways. So it's kind of electronic textiles work that we did in basements, in our garages, in our living rooms and such. It was again a kind of being with, in the sense of kind of dismantling a program that I had come with, right, and imposed, and retracing my steps. Yeah. So I think in many senses it's about understanding where people's own, right, histories of practice are sort of embedded, and how to sort of, again, depending on the circumstance, whether it should be a designer coming into these groups is another question altogether, right?
Okay, other questions, comments?
Hi, I'm Maria Hellström-Reimer, a professor here in design, and I think my question or comment, open comment, is related to this discussion partly, and you were talking also about the risk of you used the notion of enchantment, or technologies of enchantment, but also the enchantment with technology,
yes,
and the risk of ending up with some kind of new form of fetishization,
Yeah.
and how that is related also to these very kind of foundational embedded paradoxes of design, and the
Yeah.
difficulty of retracing the history and rewriting, reworking those foundational stories, narratives,
Yeah.
one of which is actually fetishism, basically, and not only the risk of fetishizing the object or the labor behind the object,
Yeah.
but also fetishizing technology as such.
Yeah.
And so how do you regard that risk while we are trying to kind of disrupt the
Yeah.
narratives?
Yeah.
We might end up fetishizing technology all over again.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a great question. I think it really depends on the stakes. Like what is the circumstance? To whom does it matter, right? In the case of, and there's some people thinking about this very deeply right now in fascinating ways, like Morgan Ames in terms of charisma, right? This charismatic quality that the laptop that came out of MIT, the one laptop per child, if anyone's familiar, right? This held this sort of promise that actually it was quite complex, right? It had, in many ways, the aftermath of that project is that it essentially wasn't taken up, but that it produced many networks of people that weren't necessarily ready to for example, repair the technology when it broke down, right? So sort of the risks are multiple. There's the kind of ways in which, in the proliferation of IoT, as we talked about earlier, there's the continuous maintenance risks to like who's able to repair, right? And this is something Laura Houston has been thinking about more recently. And so the ideas of sort of not just considering the design of a simple tool, but the sort of wider programs of maintenance labor and action that unfold as a result of that innovation work, right? So yeah, it's a great question, and there's no single way to tackle it.
Other questions? Christina, you were prepared before. Have you any more questions that you feel happy?
No, maybe someone else.
Where's Usa? It's like,
Yeah, I could.
no. I just put her in the spot.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. Thanks a lot, Daniela. Hi. So I guess what I was thinking towards the end was, it's similar to Christina's question about under what conditions can we do what things. And you've mentioned already disability studies and critical race studies, but I guess it's just this broader like search or urge for how do we get to what's not business as usual? Do we have to look
yeah.
back?
Yeah.
Like, do we have to look into
Yeah.
like you're proposing here, retracing history?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
if we see the need, how can we get out of business as usual?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question because it's not just a matter of sort of what STS has done very well, right? Thinking about the ways in which there's so much to learn from past challenges and explorations that we can, for example, the textile industry and sort of stories of automation that we can now reflect on today. But it's also a really, I think it's a question of commitment, because these things are so hard, right? I mean, it's how many times just in sort of scholarly practice are we asked to review a paper or to even do our own work, and the most immediate people that come to mind will be, again, probably part of these sort of already dominant stories. So how hard it is to maybe think about the unseen or unknown is it's going to depend on your situation, but we can all do that work, right? We can commit to sort of making that a priority, and I think that's sort of another project I'm interested in devoting more time to, is just actually answering that question for very simple things, right? I mean, a really simple example around sort of the idea of cultural probes is something that's quite popular in this human-computer interaction community, right? But there are always other forms of those probes in scholarly worlds. Of course, you know, the evocative object stories and Sherry Tuckel's book is sort of one example. But I think that there are a lot of these ways of telling method stories very differently, and we should explore those differences. I'm doing this right now with, again, Cindy Bennett in around sort of casting, in fact, quite deliberately, design as not just design, this elite kind of terminology, but as a creative expression, and sort of understanding what that term does to folks that might not feel part of the discourse, but in fact have been contributing, and actively so, for quite a long time.
Anyone else?
Hi, Janet van der Linden, Professor in Interaction Design. I'm here as a visiting professor from the UK at K3. I mean, my own work has also been in that of working with e-textiles in the last few years in particular, and working in designing things with groups of people with serious visual impairments, which has also brought the whole discussion of what is design. Because we wanted to make sure that people would be as much involved in making the decisions of what they were making, you know, and have and own those. But in order to do that, I mean, you've probably worked with electronic textiles. If you do anything, you get shortcutting of all sorts of threads going all over the place. So we had to do a lot of work in trying to make sure that when you were making your own design, that you would do that through a felt experience. Sorry, I should have made this a bit more clear perhaps, but we wanted to step away from design being about a visual process to saying, okay, if I can't see and I still want to make, then the whole process needs to be something I do through feeling my way around. And I think there were a lot of resonances in your talk about how a lot of these are very, very specialized, high-skilled works that these women have been doing over these past years, where they were very, very aware of the machines and how they worked. You know, it wasn't the machine telling them, but they knew damn well exactly where they had to go. And I find that fascinating. And it sort of goes through the whole thing of more sort of embodied ways of looking at designing. And the sort of, you know, it is involving our whole body, and it is not just something at a cognitive level, but it is something we're doing, we're involved. I've had a slightly humbling experience during my time at Malmö, also connecting with a group of weavers, as I am a weaver. And because I didn't speak any Swedish, and they, by and large, didn't speak much English, we had to almost communicate through the machines, because we know this loom will do this. And it's been a very lovely experience in that sense of sort of connecting through these machines, where you still have a shared language, and you're all operating at a sort of interesting skill level. So it's that, so I like the sort of materiality of some of the designs that you're bringing out in this talk, which is something I think needs emphasizing, and I think it's a lovely area. I don't know whether you want to reflect more on that.
Yeah, I mean, these are all great points. I think there's a lot of literature, sort of feminist literature on affect and attunement that's really useful here. And in particular, as City Download has an interesting article that's coming out soon. I would refer you to on techno-affect in particular. And that's something that, you know, you think about as an ethics and in the sort of spaces of design that you just mentioned. My student Cindy Bennett has been working in this Arduino workshop that's been organized by and for blind technologists, and thinking about sort of learning actually who is even conceived of as a technologist, right? To sort of reformulate or rethink these environments. I think there's sort of a range of concerns that bubble up in that context that wouldn't in another, and so it's about sort of thinking again in what ways, if you're training a designer to be working with or thinking about the design of technologies for blind users, then in what way are you in fact recognizing the blind quote user as themselves also actively configuring their world? Because in many ways we cast, right, the designer as a non-disabled body, and the disabled body is a non-designing body, right? And through our methods and classes and such. So I mean, these are real challenges for us in this in the role that we're in, and important. Yeah.
Anyone else? If not, I mean, I think you're going to stay around here. So
Yes.
if anyone has any questions, we can have that informally afterwards. And next summer you're going to be 1 year in Berlin. So
Oh yeah.
closer than a sabbatical. So
Yeah. Please come visit. Yeah.
I also want to say that beside this media talk, we produce a podcast series, and this morning Daniela was interviewed by Per Linder, Senior Lecturer in Interaction Design, on something, and another topic altogether. Maybe you want to say something what you talked with him about.
Oh, we talked actually a lot about this book,
Okay.
but also about IoT, Internet of Things, and maintenance, and and the work of Sarah Fox I was now a postdoc at the University of California, San Diego. So yeah, it was really fun.
Thank you very much for being here.
Oh.
This lovely talk.
Thank you. This was